She gave the world the soundtrack to its heartbreaks, its first loves, its midnight spirals, and its triumphant mornings after. She wrote songs in the margins of her school notebooks and sold them to stadiums on every continent. She became, by the most conservative accounting, the most commercially powerful musician in the history of recorded sound. And somewhere inside all of that, somewhere beneath the sequins and the stadium lights and the billion-dollar empire that rose from a girl with a guitar in a parking lot in Tennessee, something was quietly, methodically breaking. Taylor Allison Swift did not simply become famous. She was consumed by fame before she was old enough to understand what she was surrendering in exchange for it. By the time she was legally old enough to drink a glass of wine in the country that made her a legend, she had already lost things most people spend their entire lives hoping to find. A normal adolescence, the privacy of her own grief, the ability to walk through a door without calculating the distance between herself and the nearest exit. In 2019, while her mother was fighting cancer, Taylor Swift lost every song she had ever written. Not metaphorically. Not in the quiet way that artists sometimes feel their work no longer belongs to them once it reaches the world. She lost them literally, commercially, contractually, in a business deal that went through without her knowledge or consent. The masters. 15 years of creation. The recordings that had made her famous, that had made her rich, that had made her the most awarded female artist in Grammy history. Gone. Sold to a man she had publicly described as someone who had bullied her for years. She sat in front of a camera and cried. She wrote posts at midnight, trying to explain to a generation of young women who idolized her that even she, with all her money and all her lawyers and all her streaming numbers, could be stripped of the things she had built her life around. And the world did what it always does when extraordinary women show pain. It divided instantly in half. Half mourned with her. Half told her she should have read the fine print. But before we get to the moment the music was taken from her, before we understand what it costs to spend your entire adolescence building something only to watch it sold out from under you, we need to go back to the beginning of the story. Not the polished origin story she has told in 1,000 interviews, but the one underneath it. The one that explains why a girl with a perfect suburban life in a prosperous Pennsylvania town felt a hunger so enormous, so specific, so impossible to satisfy that she would pack everything she owned and relocate her entire family to the city she believed could contain her. At 14 years old. That hunger is where this story truly begins. And what it ultimately cost her is something no Grammy has ever addressed. West Reading, Pennsylvania is the kind of town that makes excellent high school principals and reliable accountants and people who coach Little League with genuine enthusiasm. It is not, by any conventional measure, the kind of town that produces cultural phenomena. The houses are tidy. The lawns are green. The expectations are specific and achievable and entirely unsuited to a child who will, by her mid-30s, generate more revenue from a single concert tour than the gross domestic product of several small nations. Taylor Allison Swift was born on December 13, 1989. Her parents named her after James Taylor, the singer-songwriter, because her mother, Andrea, believed a gender-neutral name would help her be taken more seriously in business. This detail is small and easily overlooked in the vast machinery of the Taylor Swift mythology. But it is also, in the way that small details often are, the detail that reveals everything. Andrea Swift was thinking about her daughter's career before her daughter had drawn her first breath. She was already preparing her for a world that would require her to be stronger, smarter, and more strategic than her male counterparts. She was already teaching, without words, the lesson that would drive Taylor for the next 35 years. You have to earn it twice. Once to get it. Once to keep it. Scott Swift, Taylor's father, worked as a financial advisor at Merrill Lynch. The family was comfortable in the specific, substantial way that insulates children from ordinary struggle and sometimes leaves them, paradoxically, with a hunger for something the money cannot provide. Meaning, urgency. The feeling that something real is at stake. Taylor grew up in a large stone house on a Christmas tree farm. The kind of setting that would later find its way into her music with a nostalgia that was genuine and also perhaps slightly mythologized. The childhood was beautiful. The childhood was not enough. From the beginning, Taylor existed in a body that seemed too large for the life it had been placed inside. She performed in local theater productions at the age of 9, chasing drama coaches and musical directors with a persistence that was charming in a child and slightly alarming by 12. She studied musical theater at a professional arts school in New York, commuting from Pennsylvania. She performed at festivals and competitions and anywhere else that had a microphone and an audience, no matter how small. She learned to belt. She learned to project. She learned, before she learned most other things, how to hold a room. She was the kid who needed to be seen. Not in the needy, fragile way that sometimes tips into desperation, but in the specific way of someone who has something to say and is viscerally aware that the clock is always running. Her mother took her to Nashville for the first time when she was 11. They brought a demo tape made of karaoke recordings, the kind of thing that most industry professionals would toss into a drawer without listening. They walked Music Row together, knocked on doors, and received with remarkable consistency the same answer. Come back when she is older. Come back when she has something more. Come back. Taylor Swift was 11 years old and already collecting rejections. And she was already filing each one away, not as evidence that she was wrong, but as fuel for the engine that was running at a temperature that should have worried everyone who loved her. But talent at that magnitude does not look like a warning. It looks like a gift. She was 14 when the family made the decision. Scott Swift requested a transfer from Merrill Lynch's Pennsylvania office. The family sold the stone house. They packed up everything that could be moved and relocated to Hendersonville, Tennessee, a suburb of Nashville, because their daughter had asked them to, and because the look in her eyes when she asked was the kind of look that makes parents understand, suddenly and completely, that their role has shifted. They were no longer the people who decided. They were the people who made it possible. Think about what that moment represents. A 14-year-old girl with enough gravitational force to pull her entire family out of the life they had built. Two parents who understood, on some level, that what they were doing was not entirely conventional. A little brother, Austin, 4 years younger, who simply went where the family went, the way younger siblings always do. And a girl who was stepping onto a moving train she had no way of knowing was traveling towards something extraordinary. And something else. Something she would spend decades trying to name. Adolescence is the period in which most human beings discover who they are by bumping into what they are not. They have failed friendships and bad haircuts and embarrassing phases that get buried in the soft sediment of memory. They learn themselves through the luxury of low stakes. Taylor Swift did not have that. She arrived in Nashville at 14 with a direction already fixed, and an identity that was already, to a degree unusual for a person that age, professional. At 15, she signed with Big Machine Records, a small Nashville label founded by Scott Borchetta. The contract she signed was, by the standards of the music industry, a fairly standard deal for a new artist. She did not own her masters. She would not own them for as long as she recorded under that contract. She was 15 years old, and the songs she had not yet written, the ones that would become Fearless and Speak Now and Red and 1989, those songs were already, in the logic of the contract, spoken for. She did not know yet. Or perhaps she knew and could not fully understand what it would mean later, the way none of us fully understands the fine print of the decisions we make when we are young and desperate and certain that things will work out the way they are supposed to work out. She had wanted to come to Nashville. This was the deal Nashville offered. She said yes. Here is a question worth sitting with. What was the most important decision you ever made before you were old enough to understand its full consequences? Leave it in the comments. Because for Taylor Swift, that answer is one that would haunt her for the next 2 decades, and understanding it changes everything about how her story reads. Her debut album arrived in October 2006. She was 16. The country music establishment was not entirely sure what to do with her. She was not the traditional Nashville type, not a voice built through years of gospel churches and honky-tonks and the slow, grinding apprenticeship of the road. She was a girl from Pennsylvania with a guitar and a notebook full of songs that were specific in the way that teenage feeling is specific. Immediate, urgent, and recognized by anyone who had ever been that age as the exact emotional frequency they had once occupied. She also understood instinctively and from very early that the relationship between an artist and an audience is built on the feeling of direct communication, not performance at a distance, not the elevated remove of the untouchable star. Contact. She wrote long posts online. She remembered the names of fans she had met at shows 6 months earlier. She used platforms that other artists dismissed as fads with a fluency that looked casual but was, beneath the surface, intensely deliberate. She was building something that the industry did not yet have a name for. A bond. A loyalty. A relationship between herself and an audience that would, in time, prove more durable than any contract she ever signed. The albums came fast. Fearless in 2008. The songs on it were so precisely calibrated to the emotional reality of young women navigating first love and first heartbreak that they did not merely top the charts. They became the architecture of memory for an entire generation. You remember where you were the first time you heard certain songs the way you remember where you were when something important happened. She had engineered that feeling. At 19 years old. She was 19 when Fearless won the Grammy for Album of the Year, the youngest solo artist to receive that honor at the time. The industry applauded. The industry also took note. There is a particular way the music business regards an artist at the moment they become undeniable. With admiration, yes. And also with the quiet calculation of an institution assessing how much can be extracted from something this valuable. Speak Now followed in 2010. She wrote every song on it alone, a deliberate statement in an industry that often questioned whether young female artists were truly the authors of their work. Red arrived in 2012, a double album that was so far ahead of its pop era that critics initially called it inconsistent. What they meant was that they could not categorize it, and what they could not categorize, they were not yet ready to fully reward. The audience, as it had always done, disagreed with the critics entirely and made Red one of the best-selling albums of the year. With each album, the scrutiny intensified. By Red, something had shifted in the way the press engaged with her. The songs were extraordinary, dense with specific detail and emotional complexity that her critics did not expect and could not comfortably account for. But the coverage was increasingly less about the music and more about the men who had inspired it. She dated publicly, the way young people do when they have feelings. She wrote about those feelings, the way an artist does. And the world, instead of receiving this as evidence of artistic authenticity, received it as a source of entertainment. Who was the song about? Was she the villain or the victim? The question was always somehow about her personal life rather than her art. The question was always implicitly about whether she was too much. She was always too much for someone. By 2014 and the release of 1989, Taylor Swift had done something the industry had told her was effectively impossible. She had crossed over completely. Country music's biggest star had become pop music's reigning monarch, and she had done it not by abandoning what she was, but by expanding it. by deciding that the rules about who she was supposed to be were, like all rules imposed from outside, negotiable. 1989 won the Grammy for Album of the Year. She became only the fifth act in Grammy history to win the award twice. The album sold over 10 million copies. The tour that followed was one of the highest-grossing concert tours of its year. She was everywhere. She was on every list. Time magazine, Forbes, every cultural authority that tracks these things pointed at Taylor Swift and said, simply, "Here." The squad, as the press called it, was real. A circle of famous women who appeared alongside her at events and in her music videos, and in the photographs that defined the cultural aesthetic of that particular moment. It looked like friendship. Some of it was. But friendship at that scale, friendship conducted entirely in public, friendship where every private moment has the potential to become a headline, is not simply friendship. It is a performance of friendship. And performances, no matter how sincere, eventually exhaust the performer. She smiled constantly. She was photographed constantly. She made of herself, with great discipline and no small amount of genuine talent, a person who appeared to exist entirely in celebration, entirely in triumph, entirely without the ordinary human texture of ambiguity and darkness and doubt. What was underneath that had no audience. And what was underneath was its own kind of crisis. In 2015, while the world was watching Taylor Swift accept another award and pose for another photograph and build another layer of the mythology that had by now completely surrounded her, she was eating almost nothing. This is the part of the story she did not tell for years. The part that existed entirely off camera, in the private architecture of her relationship with her own body, in the specific and devastating way that a woman who is photographed from every angle at every moment, whose appearance is discussed in every forum, can begin to hear inside her own head only the voices that confirm her worst fears about herself. She would reveal it later in the 2020 documentary Miss Americana with a directness that surprised even people who thought they knew her best. She described looking at photographs of herself and seeing someone too big. She described restricting her eating to a degree that she said a doctor would have called concerning. She described the specific cruelty of an industry that photographed her in one moment and ran the photographs alongside body commentary in the next, and a press culture that had decided her physical appearance was public property in the same way her music was. She had been performing for audiences since she was 10 years old. She had been scrutinized since she was 16, and the scrutiny had found somewhere along the way a frequency that her nervous system could not filter. Here is something worth pausing on. The same discipline that built the empire, the relentless self-monitoring, the constant calibration of every public gesture, the refusal to let anything appear uncalculated. That discipline had turned inward. And when discipline turns inward without any boundary to stop it, it stops being a tool and becomes something else entirely. The people around her were not asking if she was okay. The machine was still running. She was still running. That was all anyone needed to see. And then, in August of 2016, something happened that would push all of those private fractures into the open with a force that no amount of discipline or strategic management could contain. Have you ever been publicly humiliated in a way you could not defend against because the humiliation itself was the point? Because understanding Taylor Swift's next chapter requires sitting with that question for a moment. Whatever your answer is, the scale at which it happened to her was unlike anything most human beings will ever face. Kanye West and Taylor Swift had been in each other's orbit since September 2009, when he interrupted her acceptance speech at the MTV Video Music Awards to argue that another artist deserved the award she was holding. She was 19. The moment was broadcast to millions. She stood on that stage with the microphone in her hand and the expression of someone who has just been told, by the entire world watching at once, that the thing she thought was hers is not hers, that the celebration she had earned is being redirected. that the room she is standing in does not fully belong to her. She handled it with a composure that was, for a 19-year-old, remarkable. She went on. She kept going. She would keep going for the next 7 years, while the narrative of that moment evolved in the press into something that said far more about what the culture was willing to believe about her than it said about either of them. In early 2016, West released a song that referenced her in terms she said she had not approved and would not have approved. The details of what she was told about the song and what she consented to became the center of a public dispute that detonated in July of that year when Kim Kardashian released a recorded phone call on social media, presented as proof that Taylor had approved the lyrics she claimed she had not. The recording was partial. The context was stripped. The conclusion was drawn instantly, globally, with the speed and the mercilessness the internet reserves for women it decides have been caught. The hashtag declaring Taylor Swift overtrended globally. Millions participated. Media outlets that had spent years celebrating her used the same column inches to condemn her. The girl who had spent 20 years being careful, being strategic, being everything the industry asked her to be, was declared by a significant portion of the global public to be a fraud, a snake, a liar, a woman who had been playing the victim her entire career and had finally been exposed. She disappeared. She did not post, did not appear, did not speak. For almost a year, she was effectively absent from public life. The empty space she left behind was filled by speculation, by additional criticism, by the particular cruelty of people who assume that silence means guilt. Late-night hosts mocked her. Social media created an aesthetic of contempt around her image. She was a meme. She was a punchline. She was the thing that happened when a woman who had been too successful, too controlling of her own narrative, was finally cut back down. She has since described this period in careful terms. She said it felt like she was dying, not literally, not dramatically, but in the specific way that a person feels when the identity they have spent their entire life constructing is taken from them by a consensus they cannot argue against. Here is what the public did not know. While Taylor Swift was disappearing from public view in the summer of 2016, her mother, Andrea, had received a cancer diagnosis. The woman who had taken her daughter to Nashville at 11 years old, who had reorganized the entire family's life around her daughter's career, who had been present at every major moment for 2 decades, was sick. And Taylor could not tell the world, because the world was busy deciding what it thought of her. The weight of what she was carrying at home had no platform that felt safe enough to land on. She came back in 2017 with a new album that was deliberately dark. Reputation was the sound of a woman who had been told she was over and had decided to explore what that actually meant. She wore dark clothes. She wrapped herself in imagery that said, "You wanted a villain, so here I am." She made of the public destruction of her image a creative act. She refused to play by the rules of the comeback, because the rules of the comeback require an apology for something she did not believe she had done. Commercially, it was another enormous success. The Reputation Stadium Tour became the highest-grossing tour in the history of American music at that time. She had survived the cancellation. She had converted the destruction into fuel. But success at that level, arrived at in those circumstances, is its own kind of trap, because it confirms at the highest possible volume that the one thing that will sustain her, the only thing that has always come through when everything else falls apart, is the machine. The next album, the next tour, the next reinvention. She had learned, in the particular way that trauma teaches, that the work was the only thing she could fully control. She was about to discover that even the work could be taken from her. In June of 2019, Scott Borchetta sold Big Machine Records to a company controlled by Scooter Braun. The sale included her masters, the original recordings of every album she had made from her debut through Reputation. 15 years of work, the most commercially valuable catalog in country and pop music history. The first she knew of the sale was when it was announced publicly. She responded the same day, in a post that ran to several hundred words, with a directness and a vulnerability the public was not accustomed to seeing from her at that scale. She described trying to purchase her masters and being told the only way to do so would be to sign a new contract requiring her to record additional albums for Big Machine. One new album for every old one she wanted to own. She described what it felt like to watch 15 years of her work change hands without her consent or knowledge. And she named the person who had bought it, and she explained with the careful precision of someone who had chosen every word why that specific person holding her life's work was not something she could accept. The response from the industry was mixed in the specific way the industry responds when someone disrupts a system that benefits everyone at the table. Some rallied behind her. Others questioned her account. A few, very quietly, pointed out that she had signed the original contract, that she had agreed to its terms, and that the market was the market. She was 30 years old. She had signed that contract at 15. And the distance between those two facts, between the girl who said yes and the woman being asked to live with what that yes had meant, is the specific kind of distance that cannot be closed by success, or money, or 4 Album of the Year Grammys. Then she announced the plan that no major artist had ever attempted before. She would re-record everything. She would go back to the very beginning, back to every album from her debut through Reputation. And she would make new versions of every song. She would ask the world to listen to those instead. She would make the originals commercially irrelevant by offering the audience an alternative that came with her full blessing. Have you ever been asked to return to the beginning of who you were and do it all again, knowing now what you did not know then? Leave that in the comments. Because what Taylor Swift undertook next was, underneath all of the commercial strategy, something far more personal and far more painful than a business decision. Fearless Taylor's version arrived in 2021. She was 31. The album she was re-recording had been written between the ages of 15 and 17, in a voice that belonged to someone who had not yet experienced most of what was coming. Going back into those songs was not simply a recording session. It was an excavation. It required her to inhabit, again, the feelings she had processed and moved through and placed behind her, and to sing them with a voice that now carried every year that had passed since she first sang them. Red Taylor's version arrived later that year with a 10-minute version of a song that had existed in the fan mythology for years, as something too raw to release in its complete form. When it finally arrived, complete and uncut, it was one of the most emotionally undefended things she had ever released. Critics and fans received it as a masterpiece. What it was underneath the craft was a woman going back into one of the deepest griefs of her life and agreeing for the sake of reclaiming ownership of her own work to feel all of it again. At the same time, her mother's health had worsened. Andrea Swift's cancer had required ongoing treatment. Taylor had begun traveling with her mother on the road, wanting her close, not willing to spend the time on a tour bus while her mother was home and sick. She had also begun speaking more directly in interviews about what it felt like to watch a parent's mortality become a concrete and immediate thing rather than an abstract future event. She said, quietly and without drama, that her mother's illness had changed the way she thought about time, that it had made her understand, in a way that success had never quite forced her to understand, that the things which matter most are not the things that generate the most headlines. The private years. She had also, through all of this, been in a relationship with a British actor, Joe Alwyn, that she had protected with a deliberateness that was, coming from Taylor Swift, almost startling. He did not appear in music videos. He did not accompany her to award shows. He was present in her life, but not in her public narrative, And for a person who had spent her entire adult life in a glare of attention, that protective instinct spoke to something she was learning, slowly, about what she actually needed to survive. The relationship lasted 6 years. It ended in early 2023. She has not spoken about why. Not directly, not in the careful language she uses when she is speaking about something that still costs her to approach. But the music she released in April 2024, 31 tracks released in a single night under the title The Tortured Poets Department, contained a body of work that those who knew her writing recognized immediately as her most raw and unmediated creative response to loss she had ever made public. The songs were long and strange and searching in a way that earlier albums had not been. They sounded like someone writing at the far edge of what they could contain. Before the record was released, before the world heard it, the Eras Tour had already begun. The tour opened in March 2023. It was designed as a retrospective spanning every era of her career, a 3.5-hour theatrical event covering 17 albums worth of material, performed by a woman who danced through nearly the entire thing in heeled boots. The concept was ambitious, the execution was unprecedented, and the response from audiences was unlike anything the live music industry had ever documented. By the time the tour was over, in December 2024, it had grossed over $2 billion. It had generated an estimated $4 billion in economic activity in the cities it visited. It had been credited with measurably boosting the GDP of multiple countries. Economists wrote papers about it. Governments issued statements. It was simultaneously a concert and a cultural event and a phenomenon that the existing vocabulary of the music industry did not adequately cover. She performed 149 shows across 20 months. She performed with injuries she did not publicly disclose. She performed in conditions that would have ended other tours. In Rio de Janeiro, the crowd exceeded safe heat and density thresholds. A young fan collapsed and died. Taylor was performing when the news reached her. She addressed it from the stage and in press statements afterward, with a sincerity and a weight that required her to stand in the specific position of a person who carries some responsibility for a joy that turned catastrophic. It is not a position most human beings are ever asked to occupy. She occupied it publicly. And then she kept going, because the machine kept going. And she was the machine. At the same time, her mother's brain tumor had been disclosed. Andrea Swift had been treated for breast cancer years earlier. The cancer she was now fighting was different, a brain tumor, discovered during the testing that followed the breast cancer treatment. Taylor announced it in an interview with the particularity of someone choosing words very carefully. She said her mother's diagnosis had changed everything about the way she moved through the world. She said it had clarified things that fame had kept blurry for a long time. She also said that she could not be in two places at once, and that for the first time in her life, she was not entirely sure that the stage was always the right place to be. And then she went back on stage. Because the shows were booked, and the fans had tickets, and the machine requires feeding, and the woman inside the machine had spent 20 years learning that you do not stop. Here is the question this chapter demands. What does a person lose when they never let themselves stop? And who taught her that stopping was not allowed? Leave your answer below, because that question runs under every decision Taylor Swift has made for the last 2 decades. She turned 35 in December 2024. She arrived at that birthday as a billionaire, a designation applied to her in 2023 based on the value of her music catalog and the Eras Tour earnings combined. She was the first artist in the history of recorded music to achieve billionaire status through music and touring alone, without ventures outside the industry. She was also, by every indication available to the outside eye, running on something that was not quite sustainable. The Eras Tour had ended. The re-recordings were nearing completion. The Tortured Poets department had broken streaming records in its first 24 hours and contained, if you listened carefully, the portrait of a woman who had been living so far outside any ordinary version of human life for so long that she had begun to lose her footing. She wrote about not sleeping, about 3M as a recurring geographic location, about the specific terror of being known by millions and understood by almost no one, about the gap between what the world sees and what is actually happening, about the loneliness that does not disappear when the lights come up, that waits patiently in every dressing room, every private car, every hotel room that is indistinguishable from every other hotel room in every other city on every tour that does not seem to end. These are not the words of a person who is fine. These are the words of a person who is surviving, which is not the same thing, and who has the extraordinary gift, or perhaps the extraordinary burden, of knowing how to make survival sound beautiful. She has also been, through all of this, navigating a public relationship with Travis Kelce, the NFL player she began seeing in 2023. The relationship introduced a new dimension of attention, a new category of scrutiny, a new set of cameras in new arenas with new audiences who had not previously tracked her every expression from courtside seats during playoff games. The attention that followed them was, by any objective measure, absurd. She handled it with the discipline of someone who has been training for exactly this her entire life. She smiled. She cheered. She looked happy in all the photographs. Whether she was happy in the private, unperformed, quiet way that happiness actually feels is a question the camera has never answered for her. The camera has never answered that question. That has always been the particular tragedy at the center of this story. Taylor Swift's story is not a tragedy in the conventional sense of the word. She is not defeated. She is not broken. She is, by every external measure, triumphant in a way that is genuinely unprecedented. The records, the awards, the commercial power, the legal vindication implicit in the success of the re-recorded albums, which effectively hollowed out the commercial value of the originals she had lost. All of it is real. All of it is extraordinary. All of it was hard-won. But there is a kind of tragedy that does not require defeat to be real. There is a tragedy in the gap between what we build in public and what we lose in the process. There is a tragedy in the specific cost of a childhood spent in the machine of ambition rather than the ordinary mess of growing up. There is a tragedy in an eating disorder that nobody around her addressed because she was performing too well for anyone to ask if she was okay. There is a tragedy in losing 15 years of music to a contract signed at 15 by a girl who had no way of understanding what she was agreeing to. And there is a particular tragedy in the fact that she then spent years going back to the very beginning of herself, song by song, to make it all again, because the industry gave her no other way to take it back. She told the world who she was in the margins of her school notebooks, and then watched the world sell it back to her. She gave away her youth to build something that was then taken from her before she was old enough to know how to protect it. She survived a public cancellation while privately watching her mother fight cancer and never told anyone because the world was not in a position to hold both of those things at the same time. She has spent 35 years being told that everything she was, everything she felt, and everything she built was either not enough or too much. Too country, then too pop. Too personal, then too private. Too emotional, then too strategic. Too successful to deserve sympathy. Too famous to deserve privacy. Too powerful to be fragile. And yet somehow always, in some public forum, still being questioned about whether she truly deserved what she had earned. She earned it. She earned all of it. And the cost of earning it is written in the songs, if you listen not for the melody but for what lives underneath it. Her legacy is not in question. The music will outlast everything that has been said about it and about her. Future generations will find these songs the way every generation finds the music that tells them who they are. They will feel understood in the way that only the best music makes a person feel. The craft is extraordinary. the ambition was worth something real. But what Taylor Swift's story asks of us is harder than admiration. It asks us to look at what we celebrate and consider whether we have ever stopped to ask about the price. To wonder what it costs a person to be that visible for that long, starting that young. To consider what we might have owed a girl with a guitar in a parking lot in Nashville before she became the most powerful musician on earth. What would it have looked like to give her a little more room to be ordinary? To ask, even once, if she was okay when the answer was clearly no. To understand that the discipline and the control and the strategic perfection, that we celebrated for 2 decades, were not signs of invulnerability, but of a person who had learned, very early and very thoroughly, that vulnerability was not safe. She is still building. She is still writing. She is still, with every album and every tour and every night she stands under the lights and gives 3.5 hours of everything she has to 50,000 strangers, making something out of everything she has experienced. And that is remarkable. That will always be remarkable. But the most honest thing her music has ever asked of us is not to celebrate the achievement. It is to see the person who made it. Not the brand, not the persona, not the billionaire or the icon or the legend in the sequin jumpsuit. The girl from the Christmas tree farm who wanted, more than anything, for the words she wrote in her notebooks to mean something to someone, who gave up everything ordinary to be heard, who is still, in the quiet of hotel rooms the cameras never enter, trying to figure out whether this was what she meant when she first made that wish. She has never stopped performing. Not once. Not publicly. The smile is real, and the smile is armor, and it is possible for both of those things to be true at the same time. She is still singing. She is still going. And if you have followed this story from the Christmas tree farm in Pennsylvania to the stadiums of 6 continents, from the contract signed at 15 to the re-recordings made at 30, from the public destruction of 2016 to the quiet grief of hospital waiting rooms she has never fully described, then you already know the thing her music has always been trying to say. That you can survive your own story. That survival is its own kind of art. And that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is stand in the middle of everything they have built and admit, quietly, to no one but themselves, that they are still figuring it out. She is still figuring it out. After 35 years and $4 billion tours and a Grammy record that may never be broken, she is still asking the question she was asking at 14 years old in a new city with a guitar and everything to prove. Who am I when no one is watching? We should have given her the chance to find out. If this story moved you, if it changed something in how you hear the music you already know by heart, leave a like and subscribe for more stories that look beneath the legend. And tell us in the comments, what is the one moment from Taylor Swift's journey that has stayed with you? The one thing you have never fully allowed yourself to think about. Because sometimes the stories we know best are the ones we understand least. The girl from the Christmas tree farm gave the world everything she had. It is worth asking, finally, what the world gave back.